every UK county's most isolated village and why people live there. From a village where the nearest shop is a 2-hour hike through freezing moorland, to an island community where winter storms cut off all contact with the mainland for weeks at a time, Britain's most isolated villages are home to people who've chosen a life most of us can't even imagine. These are 21 of the UK's most remote communities, and the surprising reasons people still call them home. Let's start in the far north of Scotland, in a place that redefines what isolation actually means. Number 1. Scoraig in the Scottish Highlands sits on a remote peninsula in Wester Ross where no roads reach. The only ways in are a 6-mile hike over rough mountain terrain or a boat ride across Little Loch Broom when the weather permits. About 70 people live in this scattered community of whitewashed cottages and modern eco-homes perched on hillsides above the dark waters of the loch. There's no mains electricity, so every household generates power from wind turbines and solar panels that dot the landscape. The primary school has just 4 pupils who walk to class along muddy tracks between stone walls and grazing Highland cattle. Mail arrives by boat 3 times a week, and the nearest road ends 6 miles away at Bad Luarach on the opposite shore of the loch. Winters mean hauling supplies up steep paths in freezing rain, and summers bring midges so thick they form clouds around anyone working outside. So why do families choose to raise children here without roads or power grid? The residents say it's the strongest sense of community they've ever experienced. When someone needs help building a house or repairing a generator, the entire village turns up. Parents know their children play freely on the hills without the dangers of traffic or strangers. One mother explained her 10-year-old daughter can navigate by stars, identify every bird call on the peninsula, and fix a broken wind turbine, skills that would be impossible to learn anywhere with mains electricity. And there's something about watching the northern lights dance over Loch Broom on winter nights that makes the isolation feel like freedom rather than hardship. Number 2. Knoydart in the Scottish Highlands is often called Britain's last wilderness. The village of Inverie is the largest settlement in this roadless peninsula, accessible only by a 17-mile hike over 2 mountain passes, or a ferry from Maleg that runs when weather allows. Around 100 people live in Inverie year-round, scattered among stone cottages and newer timber houses along the shoreline. The Old Forge pub holds the title of mainland Britain's most remote pub, where locals gather around the fireplace to share stories, while rain hammers against windows looking out at the sound of sleet. Most residents work in conservation, estate management, or running small businesses catering to the hikers who trek through each summer. Power comes from a small hydro scheme on the river, and the community shop stocks essentials brought in by boat. Children attend the primary school until they're 11, then must board on the mainland for secondary education, a wrenching decision families face every year. But the real reason people stay becomes clear when you talk to families who've lived here for generations. They describe a life where work finishes when the daylight fades, where neighbours help each other through harsh winters, and where children learn to read landscapes and weather patterns instead of staring at screens. One mother explained that her daughter knows every bird call on the peninsula and can navigate by stars, skills that would be impossible to learn in any city. The price of this life is accepting that ambulances can't reach you, that food deliveries depend on weather, and that winter storms sometimes mean complete isolation for a week or more. Number 3. Fowler in the Shetland Islands sits 14 miles west of the Shetland mainland in the Atlantic Ocean. 38 people live on this wind-battered island, dominated by 500-metre sea cliffs where thousands of seabirds nest each summer. The ferry from Walls runs twice a week in good weather, but winter storms often cancel sailings for 2 or 3 weeks straight, cutting the island off completely. During these isolation periods, the island shop must stock enough supplies to last, and any medical emergencies require helicopter evacuation if conditions permit. The airstrip on the island allows small planes to land when weather allows, but winter often means weeks when flying is impossible and seas are too rough for boats. Number 4. Rackwick on the island of Hoy in Orkney nestles in a valley beneath towering cliffs on the western coast. A single track road winds down to this abandoned crofting settlement, where only a handful of houses remain occupied year-round. The Victorian poet George Mackay Brown described Rackwick as a place where the Atlantic meets the land with such violence that the stones themselves seem to remember every storm. The few remaining residents live in restored crofts surrounded by the ruins of dozens of abandoned homes, stone shells where families once raised children before leaving for mainland opportunities in the 20th century. A steep path climbs from the bay to the Old Man of Hoy, the famous sea stack that draws climbers from across the world. The isolation here isn't just geographical but temporal, a village caught between its thriving past and uncertain future. Yet the artists and writers who've chosen Rackwick describe an environment so charged with natural energy that creativity flows differently here. Number 5. Lewib on the Isle of Skye sits along the remote eastern coast, facing the mainland mountains across the Inner Sound. This scattered crofting township of whitewashed houses has no shop, no pub, and no mobile phone signal for most providers. Around 40 people live in Lewib and the surrounding area, many in houses their families have occupied for generations. The nearest village with basic services is Broadford, 8 miles of winding single-track road away. Traditional crofting still continues here with small flocks of sheep grazing the hillsides and occasional cattle in the lower fields. So why do young families choose to stay in a place where the closest supermarket requires a 40-minute drive and reliable internet is a fantasy? The crofters and artists who live here point to a way of life that follows natural rhythms rather than economic pressures. One family explained they'd rather raise children who understand where food comes from and can read weather signs than earn higher incomes in places where neighbours don't know each other's names. Number 6. Arif Ruach in the Outer Hebrides sits on the western edge of the Isle of Lewis, facing the full force of Atlantic weather. This scattered settlement of crofts and modern bungalows has no village centre, just houses spread along a winding road where Gaelic is still the first language for many residents. The population hovers around 60 people living in an area where the nearest town, Stornoway, lies 28 miles of peat bog and moorland away. Crofters here still cut peat for fuel each summer, stacking the dark blocks to dry in the constant wind that sweeps in from the ocean. The Free Church remains central to community life, with Sunday observed so strictly that children's swings are chained up and shops stay closed. Why do families remain in a place where isolation is compounded by strict religious observance that limits activities? The crofters describe a community bound by faith and tradition that gives life structure and meaning impossible to find in secular cities. Number 7. Arnall on the Isle of Lewis sits on the exposed western coast, where Atlantic gales hammer the landscape for much of the year. This crofting village of around 60 people is famous for the preserved Black House Museum, a traditional thatched dwelling that shows how Hebrideans lived until the mid-20th century. Modern houses now dominate the settlement, but crofting continues with small flocks of sheep and occasional cattle grazing the Macaire grasslands. The nearest town, Stornoway, lies 16 miles across moorland, and winter storms sometimes make even that journey treacherous. Gaelic remains the first language for older residents, though English dominates among the young. So why do families stay in a place where wind is so constant that trees can barely grow? The crofters point to land their families have worked for centuries, to a community where everyone helps with harvests and peat cutting, and to children who grow up understanding weather, wildlife and traditional skills that would die out if villages like Arnall emptied. Number 8. Glencoul in Sutherland can only be reached by boat across Loch Glencoul or by hiking miles through roadless mountains. The tiny settlement sits beneath some of Scotland's highest waterfalls, where the Abhynan Loch Big drops over cliffs in a series of cascades. Only a handful of people live here year-round in isolated cottages, maintained by estate workers and conservationists. The nearest village with a shop lies hours away by boat and vehicle. Medical emergencies require helicopter evacuation, and winters mean complete isolation for weeks when weather prevents boat trips. Yet the few residents who call Glencoul home speak about it with almost religious reverence. They describe a landscape so untouched by modern development that walking these hills feels like stepping into a previous century. The estate workers and field researchers talk about the privilege of living among wildlife that includes golden eagles, red deer and otters that swim in the loch at dawn. Number 9. Barra in the Outer Hebrides might seem too developed to qualify, but the village of Eoligary on the northern tip of the island represents true isolation. About 30 people live in this scattered settlement of crofts facing the Atlantic, where the nearest shop lies 8 miles of winding road away in Castle Bay. The beach here serves as the runway for Britain's only scheduled beach landing flights, with planes from Glasgow touching down on the sand when tides permit. Crofting and fishing sustain the community alongside tourism, from visitors arriving on the beach flights or the ferry from Oban. Winter storms can last for days, driving rain horizontally across the Macaire and cutting the settlement off from the rest of the island. So why do families stay in a place where the sea determines your transport options and winter means battling Atlantic weather? The Crofters talk about a way of life that's survived here for over 1,000 years, about children growing up bilingual and confident in 2 cultures, and about the community bonds that form when everyone depends on each other for survival through harsh seasons. Number 10. Priest's Cove at Cape Cornwall in the far southwest sits where the Atlantic meets the Bristol Channel at England's only cape. This tiny hamlet of a dozen houses perches on cliffs above a rocky cove where fishing boats are still launched by hand using a slipway cut into the rocks. The nearest village, St Just, lies 2 miles inland, but the isolation here comes from position rather than distance. When Atlantic storms roll in, which happens frequently, the hamlet feels completely cut off as waves crash over the coastal path and spray reaches the cottage windows. The fishermen and retirees who live in these granite cottages talk about the raw power of living on the very edge of England, where weather systems hit with nothing to slow them down. They describe winter nights when gales shake the houses, and summer dawns when the sea lies calm as glass, reflecting pink skies. Number 11. Forest in Teesdale in County Durham sits at the head of the valley where the Pennine Hills rise toward their highest points. Around 200 people live in this former lead mining village, where stone cottages line narrow streets below moorland that stretches to the horizon. The nearest town, Barnard Castle, lies 10 miles of winding valley road away. The isolation here multiplies in winter when snow can block the road for days and temperatures drop far below freezing. Many houses still rely on solid fuel heating, and smoke rises from chimneys across the village on cold evenings. Hill farming sustains some families while others commute to work in nearby towns when weather permits. Why do people remain in a place where winter is so harsh and opportunities so limited? The farmers and craftspeople talk about valley communities where everyone looks out for neighbours, about land their families have worked since before the Industrial Revolution, and about the satisfaction of maintaining a way of life that cities have forgotten. Number 12. Nenthead in Cumbria claims the title of England's highest village at 430 metres above sea level in the North Pennines. Around 70 people live in this former lead mining settlement, where harsh winters and short summers define the rhythm of life. The nearest town, Alston, lies 4 miles down a steep valley road that becomes treacherous when ice forms. Stone terraces march up the hillside, remnants of when over 1,000 miners lived here. Now the population consists mainly of retirees, artists and families seeking affordable housing away from expensive lowland areas. The isolation intensifies in winter, when temperatures regularly drop to -15 Celsius and snow can pile waist deep. So why do families choose England's coldest inhabited place? The residents talk about crisp winter mornings when frost covers everything like diamonds, about summer evenings when sunset lingers until nearly midnight, and about the kind of community bonds that form when everyone faces the same challenges. Number 13. Garrigill in Cumbria sits in the South Tyne Valley surrounded by high Pennine moorland. About 30 people live in this tiny village of stone cottages, where the nearest shop lies 8 miles away in Alston. The village consists of a handful of farms and houses along a single road, with the George and Dragon pub serving as the community centre. Hill farming dominates local employment, with flocks of hardy Swaledale sheep grazing the surrounding fells. Winter storms often cut power and block roads, leaving the village isolated for days. Yet families continue to farm here as their ancestors have for centuries. The farmers talk about maintaining a tradition of hill farming that's sustainable and ethical, about children growing up connected to the land and seasons, and about the freedom of living somewhere modern life hasn't homogenised into shopping centres and suburbs. Number 14. Staithes on the North Yorkshire coast sits in a narrow ravine where Roxby Beck meets the North Sea. Around 400 people live in this former fishing village, where cottages huddle together along steep cobbled lanes barely wide enough for a person to pass. The village has no through road, so visitors must park at the top of the ravine and walk down narrow paths between stone walls. The isolation here is architectural rather than geographical, a village designed around boats and fishing rather than cars and tourism. The North Sea determines everything about life in Staithes, from when boats can launch to when storms force everyone indoors. Many houses have been flooded multiple times when storm surges drive waves up the beck, yet residents rebuild and stay. Why? The fishermen and artists who live here talk about a community so tightly knit that everyone shares catches and helps repair homes after floods. Number 15. Llanderia CWM in Powys sits deep in the Cambrian mountains of mid-Wales, where a single-track road dead ends at the village. Around 30 people live in this scattered settlement of whitewashed farms and cottages surrounded by mountains that rise over 600 metres. The nearest town, Llanidloes, lies 12 miles of narrow mountain road away. There's no shop, no pub, no school, just farms that have been worked by the same families for generations. The isolation here is profound. Winter storms can dump snow that blocks roads for a week, and power cuts lasting days are routine. Mobile phone coverage is non-existent, yet Welsh-speaking farming families continue to work the land their ancestors have farmed since medieval times. Why stay in a place where modern conveniences are almost entirely absent? The hill farmers talk about land that's in their blood, about raising children who speak Welsh and understand traditional farming methods, and about the satisfaction of maintaining a culture and language that outside pressures have tried to eliminate. Number 16. Rhyw on the Lyn Peninsula in Gwynedd sits on steep slopes above the Irish Sea at the end of narrow winding lanes. Around 70 people live in this ancient village, where stone cottages cling to hillsides, offering views across the sea to Bardsey Island. The nearest town, Abersoch, lies 7 miles of single-track road, away through some of Wales' most beautiful coastal scenery. Farming and tourism sustain the economy, but the isolation comes from the landscape itself, a peninsula jutting into the Irish Sea where weather changes by the hour. The village has a long history as a Welsh stronghold where the language and culture survived English influence. Today Welsh is still spoken by many residents, and traditional ways of life continue alongside modern tourism. So why do families choose this remote corner of Wales? The farmers and craftspeople talk about land, with history stretching back thousands of years, about raising children bilingual and confident in Welsh identity, and about the privilege of living somewhere that hasn't been transformed into another identical resort town. Number 17. Gwmystwyth in Ceredigion sits high in the Cambrian mountains at the end of a road that climbs from the valleys below. Around 20 people live in this former lead mining village, where ruined mine buildings dot the surrounding hills. The nearest village with a shop, Pontywydd, lies 9 miles of mountain road away. This is one of Wales's most isolated settlements, surrounded by moorland that stretches to the horizon in every direction. The river Eastwyth flows through the valley, and the few occupied houses cluster along the single road. Winter here means deep snow, freezing temperatures, and potential isolation lasting weeks when roads become impassable. Yet families stay, running hill farms or working remotely from cottages with satellite internet. The farmers and remote workers talk about the silence of the mountains, about raising children who understand solitude as well as community, and about the freedom of living somewhere you can walk for hours without meeting another person. Number 18. Wanlockhead in Dumfries and Galloway claims the title of Scotland's highest village at 467 metres above sea level in the Lowther Hills. Around 150 people live in this former lead mining settlement, where winters are brutal and summers brief. The nearest town, Sanquhar, lies 8 miles down a steep road that becomes lethal when ice forms. The village museum preserves the mining heritage, and a few small businesses cater to tourists drawn by walking trails across the surrounding hills. But the isolation here goes beyond elevation. Wanlockhead represents a way of life that's almost disappeared, a working-class mining community transformed into something harder to define. The residents include retirees seeking affordable housing, artists attracted by the landscape, and a few families with generational ties to the village. Winter temperatures regularly drop to -20 Celsius, and snow can block roads for weeks. Number 19. St Kilda in the Outer Hebrides sits 40 miles west of the main island chain in the Atlantic Ocean. The archipelago was permanently evacuated in 1930, when the remaining 36 residents requested relocation to the mainland, making it Britain's most famous abandoned community. However, the story doesn't end there. A rotating population of conservationists, military personnel and researchers now inhabit the island seasonally, maintaining the abandoned village and studying the unique wildlife. Number 20. Lundy Island in the Bristol Channel sits 11 miles off the coast of Devon, a 3-mile-long granite plateau rising from the sea. Around 30 people live on the island year-round, working for the Lundy Island Trust, or running the pub and accommodation for the tourists who arrive on the supply boat from Bideford. The island has no cars, limited electricity from generators, and communications dependent on satellite systems. Winter storms sometimes prevent the supply boat from docking for 2 or 3 weeks, forcing residents to carefully manage food supplies and ration fresh produce. The only shop stocks basics and medical emergencies require helicopter evacuation when weather permits. So why do people choose to live on an island where winter means potential isolation and summer means hard work serving tourists? The island workers and residents talk about the privilege of living among puffins, seals and rare wildlife, about the satisfaction of a life without traffic or crime, and about community bonds formed when 30 people must cooperate to keep a tiny society functioning. Number 21. Skomer Island off the Pembrokeshire coast in Wales sits 1 mile from the mainland across the treacherous Jack Sound. While uninhabited in winter, each summer around a dozen conservationists and volunteers live on the island to study and protect its massive seabird colonies. The island hosts hundreds of thousands of Manx shearwaters, puffins and razorbills that nest in burrows and on cliffs. The seasonal isolation here is total. No mains electricity, no running water, no internet, no contact with the mainland except by boat when weather permits. The conservationists who spend months on Skomer talk about the privilege of living among wildlife spectacles most people only see in documentaries, about night skies so dark you can see satellites crossing overhead, and about the transformation that happens when you strip away every modern distraction. They describe the rhythm of life determined entirely by weather, tides and wildlife, rather than clocks or calendars. These 21 isolated villages and islands across the United Kingdom share something beyond geography. If you want to explore more about Britain's hidden landscapes and forgotten communities, there are videos about abandoned villages and the people who return to bring them back to life. The stories continue beyond what we can cover here, because every isolated place has residents with reasons for staying that go deeper than any single video can capture.